Private Michael Daniel Reeves stepped off the transport plane at Tan Son In-Hut Air Base, just outside Saigon, on 14 March 1968, and felt as if he had walked into the inside of a fever. The air was thick and hot and alive, smelling of jet fuel, mud, sweat, and something sweet and rotting he couldn't name. Engines roared, helicopters beat the sky into fragments, and somewhere far off artillery thumped in a steady rhythm, like the slow heartbeat of something buried under the ground. He squinted against the sun and adjusted his grip on his M16, trying not to look as lost as he felt. Back home in Ohio, March meant cold rain and gray skies, wet pavement and bare trees. Here the sky was a hard, glassy blue. The jungle at the edge of the base looked like a wall of green fire, dense and layered, leaves glittering with light that never quite reached the ground. The world felt too bright and too loud, and beneath it all there was a current of fear and anticipation that didn't seem to belong to any one person, but to the place itself. His orders carried his name in stiff, typed letters and sent him north, to Camp Evans near HU Letter 1 EBF, assigned to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment. On the flight up to Phu Bai, he listened to older soldiers talk in quick, low voices, telling stories that sounded too casual for the images they painted. Tet Offensive, street fighting in HU Letter 1 EBF, rockets hitting bases at night, men disappearing in the jungle without a trace. The names meant nothing concrete to him yet. A Shau Valley, QU Letter 1 EA3 and GTR Letter 1 ECB, Key San. But they were spoken with the tense respect people reserve for storms and graveyards. At Camp Evans, he met Sergeant Thomas Walker, a tall, lean man from Kentucky whose eyes seemed older than his face. Walker read his file, glanced at the line about growing up in rural Ohio, frequent time spent in wooded terrain, and looked up at him. "You're from the woods, Reeves?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant," Michael answered. Walker nodded. "Good. The jungle will try to eat your brain, but if you know how to read the land, you're already better off than half the guys here. Stay sharp. Don't get lazy. You listen more than you talk, you'll live a lot longer." Michael took the advice like he took every order, silently, carefully, tucking it away in that part of his mind that liked maps and patterns, and the way the world could be reduced to shapes and directions. As a kid, he had spent more time in the woods than in his own yard. He knew the sound of a creek before he saw it, could tell direction from the way moss grew and how the wind felt on his face. In Ohio, that had been a game. In Vietnam, it felt like the only part of himself that still made sense. Weeks passed. Patrols blurred together, green days and red mud, rain that came like a curtain and vanished just as suddenly, nights broken by distant flares and the crack of rifles somewhere out in the darkness. Men came and went, some rotated out, some disappeared into medevac helicopters, some left in black bags. Michael learned to sleep in short, hard bursts, his body always half listening, his mind quietly drawing lines. Here's the ridge, here's the river, we came from east, we turn south, we go back north if everything goes wrong. On 2 July 1968, everything went wrong. They'd been briefed the night before. Reconnaissance and search near the A Shau Valley, deeper than they usually went. The A Shau had a reputation that seeped into every conversation. It was a conduit for North Vietnamese troops, a jungle throat where helicopters vanished into cloud and never came out, a place where compasses spun and radio signals disappeared. Men told stories about patrols that walked in and never walked out, about lights in the trees at night, and voices speaking languages no one recognized. Most of it was rumor, but rumor in war had a way of turning into fact without anyone noticing when. They loaded onto A1 Hueys at 08:0, rotors chopping the humid air into hot wind. Michael sat on the edge of the bench, boots planted on the skids, rifle across his lap, helmet strap cutting into his chin. The helicopter lifted, the camp shrank, and the jungle opened beneath them, a rippling ocean of green broken only by occasional brown scars where bombs or artillery had chewed the earth. The pilots flared for landing at 8:20, dropping toward a small clearing scratched into the trees, big enough for one bird at a time. Bullets hadn't started yet, but everyone held their breath anyway. Michael jumped out, boots sinking into soft mud, moved to the edge of the tree line, and watched as the helicopters lifted off again and vanished, taking the last solid mechanical sound with them. The jungle closed around the silence like a fist. "Point, move out," Walker ordered. The line formed. Michael took the third position in the file where he could see the point man and the man behind him, using their footsteps as anchors. The air inside the jungle was thicker, dimmer, soaked in shadow. Light filtered down in broken streams, fading before it touched the ground. Vines hung like ropes, branches twisted in ways that made the trees look like frozen, reaching arms. Everything smelled alive and wet and slightly rot. They moved in silence except for the soft clink of gear and the squelch of boots. Michael's mind kept working, cataloging. Gentle downward slope, that means we're moving toward a valley. Stream off to the left, probably feeding into something larger. Ridge rising on the right, could be used against us if someone's up there. He marked the shape of a huge crooked tree they passed, the bend in a narrow stream where a rock jutted out like a tooth, the sharp turn where the trail dipped around a boulder. Each detail was another pin in the map he was making inside his head. At 11:47, the map cracked. The first shot was a single, sharp crack from somewhere ahead and above. The point man jerked and fell without a sound, his rifle tumbling from his hands. For a half second, everything paused, as if the jungle were inhaling, and then gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once. Branches exploded, leaves shredded, the air filled with the hiss and snap of bullets. Contact front, contact left. Someone screamed. Hit the deck, Walker roared. Michael threw himself down, cheeks slamming into damp soil, helmet scraping bark. Bullets tore through the space where he'd been a moment earlier, snapping twigs, showering him with dust and bits of leaf. He pulled himself behind a thick root and tried to make his body less than the size of his own fear. He fired toward the flashes, short bursts, careful, just like he'd been trained. He couldn't see the enemy clearly, only hints of shapes in the foliage. The muzzle flashes like short, angry tongues of fire. Mortar rounds started to fall, the sound of their launch distant and hollow, the impact close and heavy. One exploded so near that he felt the air punch into his chest, ears ringing, eyes watering. For a moment, everything tilted and he thought he might be upside down. The radio operator shouted coordinates, voice breaking with strain. Then his words were cut off mid-syllable by a burst that slammed into him and threw him backward. The handset flew from his hand and landed near Michael, the cord coiling like a dead snake. Reeves, left. Watch the left. Walker yelled from somewhere behind him. Michael pivoted, pressed his shoulder into the earth and shifted his aim. He saw movement between 2 trees, just a flicker, like a shadow refusing to stay still, and fired. The return fire was immediate and heavier than anything he'd expected. It was like the jungle itself had decided to shoot back. Fall back, peel right, peel right. Someone yelled, but the order got drowned in the noise, swallowed by explosions and screams. They were surrounded or close to it. Fire from the front, from the left, from somewhere to the right that he couldn't quite locate. The neat lines on the map in his head twisted, but they didn't break. Even as his heart pounded and his hands shook, some quiet part of his mind was still tracking. We came from the northeast, followed the stream down, turned around the boulder. The sun was behind us then, now it's somewhere overhead. He crawled, dragging himself behind a fallen log, firing in short bursts. The man next to him, a kid from Iowa whose name he'd known yesterday and somehow couldn't remember now, caught a round in the chest and went limp. Michael forced himself not to look, not to think. He only moved, breathed, shot, counted the seconds between mortar thumps. He finally reached Walker and 2 other men. Higgins, older than most of them, face gray with shock, and Morales, young, dark-eyed, breathing too fast. Walker was propped against a tree, his left shoulder a mess of blood and torn fabric, his hand pressed hard against it. "We're cut off," Walker rasped, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Other squads, I don't know. Radio's gone." Michael glanced at the broken handset lying a few feet away, its plastic casing cracked. The antenna snapped off. "Yes, Sergeant." Walker's eyes drilled into his. Despite the pain, they were clear and sharp. "You know where we are." Somewhere underneath the fear and the noise and the smell of explosives, the part of Michael that loved maps and trails unfurled. He saw the path they'd taken as if it were traced in light on the underside of his skull. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. "We crossed a stream about 40 minutes ago that bends back north, then east. If we get back to it and follow it down, it should lead us close to the LZ. There was a twisted tree at the bend like a hook. I remember it." Walker stared at him for a second longer, as if weighing his life in his hands. "You sure, Reeves?" Michael swallowed hard. "I don't get lost, Sergeant," he said, and the words came out soft but firm. A sentence floated up from a memory that didn't belong to this jungle. An old neighbor from Yugoslavia back home, talking about a war that had burned through his country long before Michael was born. Vajnik koji si vratio, ali nikad si nij izgubio. The soldier who came back but was never lost. "Fine," Walker panted. "You take whoever you can peel off and move. I'll hold here with whoever's left. Get to the LZ, call an air arty something, just move, now." Michael didn't want to leave. Every part of him screamed against it. But a different kind of logic pushed back. If they all stayed, they'd all die here. If some left, some might live. The map in his head didn't care about guilt. It cared about paths and outcomes. He grabbed Morales and Higgins, hissing at them to move. On the way down the slope toward the faint sound of water, he found one more man, a figure crouched behind a tangle of roots, firing in controlled bursts toward the unseen enemy. When Michael tapped his shoulder, the man turned. Michael had never seen him before. He wore a U.S. uniform, but it was oddly clean in places, patched in others, as if it had been assembled from pieces. There were no clear unit patches, just a faint outline where one might have been. His face was streaked with mud, but beneath it his features were sharper than most of the guys from the States, cheekbones more pronounced, eyes dark and narrow. He looked at Michael with an expression that was almost calm. "We're pulling back," Michael shouted over the noise. "Stream northeast, LZ, move." The man nodded once. He didn't shout anything back. He didn't say a word. He just fell into step as Michael led the way. The four other men following, hunched low, adrenaline driving them forward. They slid and crawled down the slope, the sound of the firefight fading behind them with each yard they gained. Bullets still snapped through leaves overhead, but less often now. Once, a mortar round smacked into a tree ahead and detonated, showering them with splinters. Michael felt a sting on his arm but kept moving. The jungle thickened, then opened slightly and the stream appeared at last, a narrow ribbon of muddy water winding through stones and roots. "In the water," Michael ordered. "Less sign, less sound. Stay low, don't talk." They stepped into the stream. The mud tried to suck at their boots, the water cool around their ankles and calves. Leeches would come later if they made it that far. For now, the stream bed gave them a path that cut through the chaos. They moved single file, using the banks as cover. Ferns and hanging vines brushed their shoulders, sometimes their faces. Every so often Michael would glance back, counting. Morales, Higgins, the quiet stranger, and the last man. A shaken radio operator from another squad who clutched a wounded arm to his chest. The stranger never spoke. When Morales, shaking and pale, whispered, "What's your name, man?" The stranger only looked at him and then down at the water, as if sound itself were dangerous. He lifted one muddy hand and drew 3 letters on the surface, disturbing the reflection. H-A-L-E, Hale. Morales breathed. The man nodded once. There was something odd about the way his head moved, a fraction too smooth, too controlled, like someone copying a gesture they'd only seen from a distance. They walked for what felt like hours. In reality, perhaps 90 minutes passed. The jungle above them thickened into a green ceiling that let almost no light through. It felt like being inside a long throat, the stream their only guide. Every few minutes Michael would pause, listen, and then continue. Far away, the rumble of distant artillery rolled over the hills, but the immediate gunfire had faded. Once, they heard voices off to their right, Vietnamese, clipped and fast. They pressed themselves against the muddy bank, half submerged, holding their breath. Michael could feel the man named Hale next to him, his body absolutely still, not trembling, not panting. Just still, as if he belonged to the jungle more than he did to the men around him. The voices drew closer. A branch snapped. Someone laughed. For a terrifying moment, Michael thought one of the enemy soldiers would step right to the edge of the stream and look down at them. Then the voices moved off, swallowed by distance. When they finally reached the twisted tree Michael had remembered, its roots clenching a rock like fingers, he felt a surge of grim relief. "We're close," he whispered. "LZ is up that way." He pointed northeast, toward a slope that rose out of the jungle, thinner and drier near the top. Climbing was torture. Their legs were heavy, lungs burning, bodies complaining after too much fear and too little rest. Higgins stumbled twice. Morales helped him up. The radio operator gritted his teeth and carried his useless set like a burden he wasn't allowed to drop. Hale moved in silence, almost too easily, his feet finding holds as if he'd walked this path 100 times. They broke out of the tree line at last onto the edge of the clearing. The LZ looked smaller than Michael remembered, a rough circle of trampled grass and exposed dirt. No helicopters waited there now. The sky above it felt too big. They set a shaky perimeter. Morales got the radio working enough to spit static and fragments of words. After several attempts, they reached a unit back at Camp Evans, voices crackling and overlapping. "Charlie Element, repeat, survivors at grid." Say again, you're breaking up." Michael gave coordinates, forcing his voice to stay calm. He tried not to notice how few they were. There had been 32 men in their element that morning. Now there were 5. "Hold position," the voice on the radio finally said. "Birds inbound, 20 mics." They waited, the second stretching. Every rustle in the trees felt like a potential attack. Every bird call sounded like a signal. Michael's mind kept scanning. If they hit us from that ridge, where do we move? If they shell the LZ, where's the lowest ground? No one talked much. Morales muttered a prayer under his breath. Higgins stared at the ground, eyes unfocused. The radio operator sat with his back against a stump, face pale. Hale sat a little apart from them all, just inside the tree line, back straight, eyes unfathomable. He held his rifle across his lap. From where Michael sat, he could see that the serial number on the weapon had been scratched and worn, as if someone had tried to erase it. "Where you from?" Michael asked quietly, when the silence had stretched too long. Hale looked at him for a moment, then lifted his hand to his throat and shook his head, mouth forming a small, apologetic line. He tapped his own lips, then ear, then shrugged. "Mute," Higgins said, watching. "Well, hell, at least you can shoot." Hale gave a small, tight smile. For a second in the dim light, the expression looked wrong on his face, like a mask slipping into place. The helicopters arrived at 65, announced by the distant chop of rotors. Relief washed through Michael so strongly his legs almost gave out. The Hueys came in low and fast, wary of unseen guns. Dust and grass exploded upward as they flared and hovered. The men rushed forward when the crew chief waved them, ducking under the blades, piling into the bay. Michael climbed aboard and turned to check the others. Morales, Higgins, the RTO, all in. Hale was last, hand on the skid. For a fraction of a second, Michael had the strangest impression that Hale wasn't sure whether to get on. His eyes flicked from the tree line to Michael's face, and then he pulled himself up and in, sitting near the open door, one hand on the frame, fingers curled in a too calm grip. The Huey lifted, the jungle falling away beneath them. As they rose, Michael watched the clearing shrink and vanish, swallowed by the endless green. He felt the weight of the day settle on him like another body. Back at Camp Evans, the debriefing was short and bitter. The officers wanted coordinates, timelines, casualty estimates. Michael answered what he could, describing the ambush, the directions of fire, the path of retreat. "So you led these men back to the LZ?" A captain asked, eyes narrow. "Yes, sir," Michael said. "How?" the captain pressed. "I remembered the terrain, sir. The twisted tree, the bend in the stream. I knew we'd crossed it before. I followed it back." The captain studied him a moment, then nodded. "Good work, Private. You probably saved their lives." Afterwards, he sat on his cot in the canvas tent, staring at the dull fabric. His hands shook when he tried to lace his boots. Outside, men shouted, vehicles moved. Someone laughed too loudly. The normal sounds of the base felt like the wrong soundtrack for the images looping in his mind. Morales came by to sit with him, eyes still wide, face thinner than it had been that morning. Higgins shuffled in later, limping slightly. They talked, but only around the edges of things. How hot it had been, how loud. No one wanted to mention how many were missing. "Hey," Morales said at one point, scratching at a new bandage on his arm. "That guy, Hale, what was with him? I don't remember seeing him before today." "You?" "No," Michael admitted. "I thought he was from another squad at first, attached last minute." "Yeah, but no one knew him. I asked around in the tent line. Nobody's seen him before." Morales frowned. "Maybe I'm just mixing faces up. Everything happened too fast." That night before lights out, a medic came to the tent with a clipboard. He checked dog tags against names, verifying who had returned. When he reached the end of the line, Michael cleared his throat. "Doc, did you get Hale on that list?" "Who?" the medic asked. "Hale, Hale, he was with us, came back on the bird." Well, the medic flicked through his paperwork, finger running down columns of names. "Morales, Higgins, Farmer, Reeves. That's it for your group. No Hale." "He was there," Michael insisted, trying to keep his voice level. Medium height, kind of lean, mud on his face, quiet. "He rode back with us. Grabbed the door frame, sat by the gunner." "Maybe from a different unit," the medic said. "But I've got the manifest for that flight. Nobody by that name." "You sure you got that right?" Morales, lying on his cot, propped himself up on one elbow. "Doc, I saw him too. He wrote his name in the mud. Hale said he couldn't talk, or showed he couldn't, I mean." The medic shrugged, tapped the clipboard. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes in the chaos you think you see people who ain't there. Stress does that. If he's real, he'll turn up on some other report. If he doesn't, admin will chase it down." He left, taking the flimsy reassurance with him. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it came in fragments. Michael dreamed of the stream, its water black, reflecting a sky he didn't recognize. In the dream, he walked alone, boots echoing on a surface that sounded like metal instead of stone. The jungle leaned closer, branches whispering. Hale walked ahead of him in that dream, always just far enough away that Michael couldn't see his face clearly, only the outline of his shoulders and the curve of his neck. When Michael called his name, no sound came out. The next day they had a formation, roll call. Names were read, some marked KIA, some MIA, some WIA. There was no Hale. No matter how hard Michael listened, he never heard the name. He went to personnel 2 days later, under the weak pretext of checking his own records. Filing cabinets lined the room, papers stacked on metal desks, typewriters clicking steadily. The clerk, a thin sergeant with ink on his fingers, raised his eyebrows when Michael spelled out the name. "Hale, don't ring a bell, I can check." He rifled through a cabinet, then another. "No Hale assigned to your company. No Hale rotated in this month. We had a haul, but he got shipped south in May. Sure you got the name right?" "He wrote it in the dirt," Michael said quietly. "I saw it." The clerk shrugged. "Then he belongs to somebody's clerical error. Happens all the time out here. Guys move, units shift, records lag behind. Don't lose sleep over it. Don't lose sleep over it." As if that were something you could order a man not to do. The next mission kept them out for days. They came back tired and dirty and a little hollower. Life in camp moved on in its rough, steady rhythm. Men played cards, wrote letters, told jokes that weren't as funny as they pretended. Rocket attacks came at night sometimes, sudden and shrieking, throwing shards of metal into the sky. Michael's world shrank to patrols, maintenance, briefings, and the constant awareness of where he was in relation to everything else. He tried to push Hale out of his mind, but small things tugged him back. Once, in the mess line, he thought he saw the back of Hale's head a few places ahead, a particular angle, the way the hair sat against the neck. When the man turned, it was someone else. Another time, he woke in the middle of the night with a ringing certainty that Hale was standing just outside the tent. He lay there, listening, heart pounding, but heard only the regular breathing of the men around him and the occasional distant call of some jungle animal. On 10 November 1968, just before dawn, Camp Evans took a heavy mortar and rocket attack. The sirens wailed. The night broke open with light and sound. Men rolled out of bunks, pulling on boots, grabbing helmets. Michael barely had time to reach for his rifle before an explosion picked him up and flung him into a wall. Pain lanced up his left leg like a hot wire. The world went white for a second, then red, then gray. He woke in the aid station with bandages wrapped tight around his thigh, the air smelling of antiseptic and sweat. Outside, voices rose and fell. A medic told him he'd taken shrapnel, that he was lucky, that others hadn't been. The word evac drifted through the conversation like a ghost. On 2 December 1968, Michael boarded a plane bound for the United States. The air inside the aircraft was cool and recirculated. The men around him were quiet, some sleeping, some staring at nothing. His leg ached. The bandages felt like a tight map wrapped around his muscles, marking out wounds he couldn't yet interpret. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio smelled like jet fuel and snow. The air bit his lungs when he stepped off the plane. His parents met him a few days later, on 18 December, in front of a brick building where someone had hung a faded "Welcome Home" banner. His mother cried and held him too tightly. His father gripped his hand in a way that said all the things he didn't have words for. "You came back," his mother whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it less fragile. "Thank God, you came back." Well, he did what everyone expected. He smiled, he said, "Yeah, I'm home." He let neighbors pat his shoulder and ask him vague questions. At night he lay awake, listening to the radiator ticking and the wind outside, and somewhere beneath that the remembered sound of rotors and the muffled echo of explosions. Sometimes, just as he was drifting toward sleep, he would hear another sound, a faint splash, like a boot stepping into shallow water. He could see in his mind's eye the muddy stream in the A Shau Valley, the water rippling around their legs. He would see a figure walking ahead of him just slightly out of reach. Hale's back the slope of his shoulders, always facing away, always silent. He tried college in 1970. The campus felt strange and too open. When professors talked about history, he found himself marking dates in his notebook next to coordinates only he understood. When other students argued about the war, shouting slogans and waving signs, he walked the edges of the crowd, feeling like a man who knew the shape of a place everyone else was only guessing at from a map. In April 1975, when Saigon fell and the world watched helicopters taking off from rooftops, he sat in his small apartment and watched too. The camera panned across crowds, faces upturned, arms reaching. For an instant, among the packed bodies, he thought he saw a familiar profile, a sharp cheekbone, dark eyes, the ghost of a scar along the neck. The image flickered, replaced by another. He turned the television off. Time moved on. He worked odd jobs, then settled into a steady one, driving deliveries, navigating the streets of Dayton with the same quiet competence he'd used in the jungle. He never got lost, not once. It became a kind of odd joke amongst his coworkers. Give Reeves any address, any back road, and he'd find it first try. "Man, you're like a walking map," one of them said once, laughing. "What they do to you over there, implant a compass." Michael smiled, but the word implant made him feel suddenly cold. In December 1983, he visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The black wall stood quiet, reflecting the sky and the people in front of it in its polished surface. Names were carved into it in long, unbroken lines. He walked slowly, searching. He found Walker's name, Morales's, the RTO from that day. He touched each one with his fingertips, the cold stone grounding him. His reflection hovered over the letters, older and more tired than the boy in uniform who'd stepped into the A Shau. He didn't expect to find Hale, but some part of him looked anyway, eyes scanning for the letters Hale. There were Halls, Hales in other units, but none that matched what little he knew. Still, an odd thought flashed through his mind. What if he was here under another name? What if he was etched into the stone in a way Michael would never recognize? On the way back to his motel that evening, he passed a small bookstore. In the window, a paperback caught his eye, The Enemy's Eyes, accounts from former Viet Cong. He went in, bought it, and spent half the night reading. One chapter mentioned Pathfinders, local guides, scouts who led units through the jungle, knew every path, every stream. A photograph on one page showed a group of them standing in front of a tree line, rifles in their hands, faces unsmiling. One of the men in the back row had a scar on his neck. The picture was slightly blurred, aged. The caption underneath read, Viet Cong Pathfinder Unit, Thua Thien Province, 1965. Several members later reported missing, presumed dead. Michael stared at that face for a long time. The angle, the lines, the expression were close enough to twist his stomach into knots. He looked at the caption again. Missing, presumed dead. He closed the book and sat in the quiet motel room, listening to the heater hum. The words he'd heard as a boy came back to him, and this time they slid into place with a weight they'd never had before. Vodnik Koji si Vratio, Ali Niket Sinide Izgubio. A soldier who came back but was never lost. Was that about him? Or someone like Hale? Or both? Years later, after his parents were gone and his hair had gone gray, Michael found himself thinking more often about that day in July 1968. Not just the ambush, not just the escape, but the details he couldn't quite fit into any normal explanation. The way Hale had moved through the jungle like he belonged to it. The way he never spoke but seemed to understand everything. The uniform that didn't quite match. The absence in the records, like a shadow where a person should be. One autumn night, long after midnight, he woke from a dream of the jungle. The room was dark, the only light the faint orange glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains. He lay there, heart pounding, listening. There it was, a soft drip, 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 like water falling from leaves onto the surface of a stream. He knew that sound. It didn't belong in his small, dry bedroom in Ohio. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head toward the corner of the room, where the darkness looked just a shade deeper. For a moment, less than a second, maybe more, he thought he saw a figure standing there. Not fully formed, more like a denser patch of shadow in the dark. Shoulders, the hint of a head turning. A dull gleam like eyes catching light that wasn't there. His breath caught. He didn't move. He didn't reach for the lamp. The figure didn't move either. Then so softly Michael almost thought he imagined it, he heard a voice. A whisper, shaped like English but with an accent that bent the syllables into a stranger's song. I never lost, it said. The words seemed to come from inside his head and from the corner of the room at the same time. Michael blinked. The shadow was gone. The room was just a room again. The drip of water faded, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing outside. He lay there for a long time, staring at the empty corner. In the weeks that followed, he grew more and more convinced that whatever had happened in that valley on 2 July 1968 was not just a story of an ambush and an escape. Something else had moved through that day with them. Something that didn't entirely belong to one side or the other, or even to one time. He dug out the worn book he'd bought in D.C. and looked again at the photograph of the Viet Cong Pathfinders. The man with the scar on his neck looked back at him across the years, his expression unreadable. Missing, presumed dead. What if, Michael thought, not for the first time, That man had never truly left the jungle. What if the A Shau Valley, with its twisting paths and choking vines and vanishing patrols, was a place where getting lost didn't just mean wandering off the map, but slipping out of ordinary time altogether? Somewhere between life and death, between enemy and ally, between record and rumor. Maybe Hale had once been a real man, a Pathfinder who knew every stream, every ridge. Maybe he had died in 1965, or 1964, or some other year that only the trees remembered. Maybe part of him had remained, bound to the terrain he knew better than anyone. And maybe, on 2 July 1968, when another group of young, frightened men stumbled into that same killing ground, something in him had answered again, stepping forward out of habit or duty or something stranger. A soldier who returned but was never lost. The thought should have scared Michael more than it did. Instead, it settled into him like a piece of the map finally falling into place. He realized slowly that he'd spent his whole life since the war doing what he had always done, orienting himself, finding where he was in relation to the world, to the people around him, to the dates moving past on calendars and the headlines marching across television screens. He always knew where he stood. That was his gift, or his curse. He also realized that he was not the only one. On the 40th anniversary of the ambush, 2 July 2008, Michael drove out of town, away from the streets he knew by heart, toward the edge of a state park where the trees grew thick and the ground sloped down toward a creek. He parked, got out, and walked into the woods until the sounds of traffic faded. The air smelled different from Vietnam, less humid, less heavy, but the song of water over stones was the same. He followed the creek, boots scuffing leaves, breath steady. The sun filtered through the branches overhead, breaking into fragments on the surface of the stream. After a while, he stopped at a bend where a fallen tree lay across the water, its trunk covered in moss. He crouched down, reached out, and with one finger drew 3 letters into the damp earth at the edge of the creek. H-A-L-E. The letters darkened as the water seeped in, then slowly distorted as droplets fell from the moss above. For a moment, in the reflection of the stream, he saw his own face and another layered over it. Younger, darker eyes, that same thin scar along the neck. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that he hadn't already thought 1,000 times. He just nodded once, a small gesture of recognition, and stood up. As he walked back toward his car, he didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't need to. He knew the path now, not just in the woods of Ohio, but in the deeper sense that had carried him through that distant jungle so many years before. He had come back. His body had left the war, his name written on no wall, his address listed on driver's licenses and tax forms and all the mundane documents of civilian life. But a part of him still walked beside a muddy stream in central Vietnam, and perhaps always would. Vajnik Koji si Vratio, Ali Niked si Nij is Gubio, the soldier who returned but was never lost. And somewhere, in a valley on the far side of the world where the mist hangs low and the paths twist under the trees, another soldier, or whatever was left of him, still walked too, guiding strangers through a place that didn't want to let them go. A Pathfinder who had once been flesh and blood, then rumor, then something quieter and more enduring. A presence that knew every bend in the stream, every rise of the ground. A presence who, when men stumbled through the jungle terrified and alone, might fall in beside them, silent and sure, leading them back toward a clearing in the trees and the sound of rotors in the sky. One came back to Ohio, carrying the map inside his head. One never left the valley because he was the map, and between them, like a thin line drawn across years and continents, there remained that single, stubborn truth. Neither of them was ever truly lost.